Hello everyone, this is Dr. Tyler Brown here for the very first of his Byzantine Tangents. This video is going to be part one of a six-part series of dividing the Byzantine Empire's 1,000-year history into chunks of about 200 years, where instead of going over the major dates and events, I'm going to hash out what the time period was like. I'm going to go over things like how the government was structured, how was the economy, how was the culture and religion of each time period. Because it is not the same all the way through. Each period has its own quirks and changes over time. Before I can do that, I should talk a little bit about where I want to start. Because the Byzantine Empire really is just the Roman Empire in the East. So a starting date can get a little arbitrary. But I'm going to follow the lead of Dr. Warren Treadgold and place the beginning with the first year of the reign of Emperor Diocletian, because he's the guy who ended the decades-long crisis of the 3rd century and really got the ball rolling for the unique structure of government that the East would have going forward. So I would start there. But immediately I have to start before that to tell you what was happening before then to get a sense of what he changed. The first 200 years of Roman history went fairly smoothly for them, the period that we like to call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, where one empire stretched from Spain out to the Tigris and Euphrates, up from Britain down to Libya. During that period, despite what you'd see on a map, the Roman government wasn't actually that large. All of these places had plenty of local governments of various sorts, and what the Romans liked doing is showing up and working with those local governments who would do most of the government jobs for them. The main thing that the Roman state was concerned with was providing military defense and ensuring the tribute and taxes went back up to Rome. Herod the Great in Judea was an archetypal example there. If the Romans could set up proxy rulers and puppet kings instead of having to install a governor themselves, especially on the border, they would much prefer to do that. And even at the capital of Rome, the government for the empire as a whole simply wasn't very large. You're not dealing with a vast bureaucracy here. The Roman army was large, but even that was not nearly so huge considering the size of territory we're talking about. And then you hit the 3rd century, the 200s AD, and there suddenly starts to be a shift where the Roman army gets bigger and more important, and you get a series of emperors that prioritize the army so much that the army realizes that they're the ones who can make or break emperors. And so you get a huge stretch, decades and decades, where any time a Roman general was successful, he and his army would declare him emperor, and he would march on down to Rome to make himself the master of this whole vast empire. And every Roman general thought he could do this. So you get civil wars, one after the other, over and over and over. There was rarely an emperor that lasted more than a few years. It's constant fighting. And even though there were external conflicts at this time, particularly with the Persian Empire out east, and the various Germanic tribes across the Danube River, the main source of conflict was Roman versus Roman. Constant civil wars, years and years of this. And it wasn't just the ambitious generals doing this, by the way. The average Roman soldier realized that if the general of his army could become emperor, when he becomes the master of the government, the particular army that put him there are going to get a lot of privileges and kickbacks. So you have some cases of Roman generals who are claiming that he didn't really want to overthrow the government, but his soldiers insisted. And there are times when I think there is some truth to that. That wasn't just an excuse. More often than not, I think it was a combination of the ambition of the general growing and the soldiers also forcing that upon him. And this was a self-perpetuating cycle. Diocletian stands out because in the year 284, he stops this. He finally finds a way to break the cycle. He started as one of these ambitious generals, but he found a way to break the cycle, for one thing by enforcing his overwhelming will on the whole empire. His own cult of personality wasn't enough here. Diocletian had some plans for how things were going to go. For one thing, he vastly increased the size of the army to deal with the constant invasions that were coming from outside the borders. In the eastern part of the empire that we're going to focus on, the army went from from about 200,000 people to around 300,000. This is a huge increase of men here. This army was initially divided up into 15 commands placed along the border such that they could do their very important job of fighting foreign invasions and stop being near the capital where they could go and overthrow it. So initially, these soldiers were all stationed along the border, with a couple of exceptions for particularly restless provinces in the interior. Later emperors would add a mobile field army that could be stationed throughout the empire as crises occurred, including a couple armies that followed the emperor wherever he went. Initially, this was for the very practical purposes that you needed to guard both the border and have a mobile army. Even just the period we're talking about, which I cut off around 457 with the end of the reign of Emperor Marcian. Already, the focus on the field army means that these border guards are gradually going to get drained of all of their best people and resources, and even after a certain point, their pay. It gets to the point that by the end of this period, this 200,000 men that are stationed throughout the border are mostly good for dealing with local police actions and raiders, and not all that great in actually preventing an invasion, or even sometimes holding the line before the field army can get there. And it doesn't help, again, that the state gradually decreases their pay, but even the field army's pay gradually gets decreased. 300,000 men is not a small number to have to pay, especially since at the beginning the state felt obligated to provide arms and food for all of these soldiers in addition to their actual pay. By the end, the state is just giving them cash and telling them to provide their own resources. An important distinction to keep in mind throughout this period is while the border army were what we might call Romans, men who were organized in the traditional style and were integrated into the system, the mobile army were largely barbarians from the outside. This was where those federati, the barbarian tribes from the German region that were hired out wholesale by the Roman system to work for them, they worked for the mobile army, whole cloth. And even those Romans who didn't come from a Germanic tribal origin, who did join the mobile army, they were more likely to pick up Germanic habits of dress and fighting rather than the other way around. The mobile army assimilated Romans into the Germanic style, and this meant that the mobile army was culturally different than the mainstream society. Religiously different as well. The Arian heresy of Christianity took off far more thoroughly among the Germanic outsiders than any of the Romans inside the empire, and this divide added a religious divide onto the cultural and political ones these various Germanic tribes had. This was true in the West as well as the East, and this meant that if any general among the mobile army became popular in this period, they were an outsider much more than the crisis of the 3rd century, where they were insiders and thus could become emperors. This meant that even in cases where a Germanic leader became a sort of generalissimo figure ruling behind the scenes, and this does happen in this period, they're never in a position to simply launch a civil war and become emperor. I do want you to keep in mind that in this period, the mobile army is very heavily Germanic. This is going to cause tensions that will boil over in the next period, but just know that by the end, the mobile army is religiously and culturally, and one might even say ethnically different from the mainstream population. And that leads to the next element of Diocletian's reform plan. Because this army was so much bigger and more expensive, he needed to redo the tax system. And suddenly, just asking the locals to give kickbacks to the state wasn't enough. Diocletian suddenly had a much more thorough tax system that he had to enact over the whole empire. This wasn't simply a matter of asking the locals to give kickbacks. There was going to be a uniform tax system across the whole thing, modified according to what given land and a given population could provide. This was going to bring in, supposedly, a lot higher revenue than what the old system would do. Now, the people that this impacted the most were not just the average landowner, although for many of them this could be the very first time that the Roman state ever asked anything substantial for any of them. This was a more thorough reaching down of the tax from above than it ever occurred anywhere. But the ones that got hit hard by this the most were actually the elites in the local areas. For the average area, the Romans relied on the local elites of a city, called decurions, to actually collect the taxes from their region. This was not a cushy job, because while the decurions could absolutely ask for more taxes from their subordinates and from the local peasants, more than the state was asking for in order to get a kickback, the numbers the state asked for could be much higher than that. And the decurions couldn't afford to just ruin all of the locals, and even if they did, that wouldn't even be enough sometimes. So, for the decurions, when the state asked for certain revenues at the end of the year, if they couldn't extract that from the locals, the decurions had to pay the difference out of pocket. This was a position that could ruin them on bad years, because you better believe that changing the tax assessment didn't happen often, because that was incredibly difficult to implement across the whole empire. So, decurions didn't want this job. It could ruin them. So, suddenly, more and more elites in the Roman world found staying in their cities and getting the cushy government post wasn't paying as much as it used to, and they found various means to escape. Some of them joined the army, some of them joined the growing church, which we'll talk about in a bit, and some of them simply tried to go higher in rank to the class of senators, because those guys initially didn't have to do this job. It got so bad that the ones who did reach senator rank, who, bear in mind, became the elite of the whole empire, laws were passed to tell them that no, they still had to do their job of being a decurion. It became a real problem. Suddenly, a Roman state, which had been relatively light on the whole empire, not only had a much vaster army that was stationed up and down the border, but they had a more robust tax system that was definitely being felt from everyone from the lowest Roman to the highest. While it particularly hit the landowners and the decurions, as I said, everyone was feeling this. It got to the point that most people measured years by when the tax assessment happened. It reached into people's lives greater than ever before. And because of this, suddenly the low-key centralized bureaucracy of the old days simply wasn't enough. In order to deal with this vastly expanded military and tax system, the central government needed an expanded bureaucracy. This one did not expand nearly to the level of the military, but we're still dealing with about 15,000 bureaucrats for the eastern half of the empire, 2,500 of which stayed in the capital and ran the central bureaucracy. This is much higher than the old days. And what this is all coming together to be is a centralized, centrally governed state in a way that the old Roman Empire didn't have. It was much more loose, much more personality-based for the emperors, and later it was ruled by whichever general was the strongest. But what you're starting to develop here is a centralized, bureaucratized state, in a way that nowhere in the empire had seen. This bureaucracy became its own elite class, separate from the military officers and the generals. This was definitely a change from the old Roman ways. You want to go back to the Republic, going through the central state and going through the military were all part of the same process. But here, the civil service families, the ones who provided the civil service, became a separate elite from the families that provided the soldiers and generals. This bifurcation in the Byzantine Empire is a recurring theme that's going to happen in various forms all the way up to the end. Another change during this period, as a result of the increase in government, is the first appearance of general collections of law codes that apply through the whole empire, which is a natural result of the bureaucracy and the state reaching into people's lives much more than before. The first major one of note was in 438, the Theodosian Code, and I want to emphasize that even though this code book that came out in 438 only compiled laws that had been written and enacted since the year 312, when Constantine made Christianity legal, only about 100 years of laws. The code that Theodosius made was already a massive, unwieldy thing that you needed specialized training in order to even comprehend. And even with that knowledge, there were all sorts of loopholes and uneven applications throughout the empire. You're already getting a sense that this top-heavy government was a bit difficult for even emperors and the bureaucracy to even control. That's actually a change that Diocletian brought from the crisis of the 3rd century, the time of the constant civil wars. The fact that there is a centralized bureaucracy rather than just a mobile military leadership is already a big change. And halfway through our period, around the year 395, the emperors stop moving around with the army. They stop just being the greatest general. They settle down in Constantine's fancy new capital, Constantinople, and run the state, because that has become a full-time job now, rather than just running the military. This is a huge change. The fact that there's a big centralized state out east is not something anyone there had ever seen. Not since the unified days of Alexander the Great, some 5 or so centuries before. Besides the new civil bureaucracy and the army, you also have another batch of elites that are in the Eastern Empire, and these are people that, during the time period, are called senators. Now, when we use that term, we think of the holders of a particular government position in the American style, but I want you to forget about that here. When the Romans think of a senator, they think of more a social class, the highest elite, the ones who hold the greatest wealth in terms of land. Both the West and the Eastern halves of the Roman Empire had senators, mind. But there's a big difference between the two that only increases as time goes on throughout this period. And that's that the Western senators come from very old wealthy families, many of them tracing their wealth back to the days of the Republic. What this means is they've had centuries to accumulate landholdings to the point that they are vastly wealthy. Out in the western half of the empire, it's the senators that have a solid chunk of the wealth in terms of land. In the East, a lot of the senators are newer. Constantine brought many of them over to his new capital in Constantinople in the early 300s, and even by the end of this period, none of them have had a chance to gobble up the land the way the Western senators did. And this meant that while senators are influential, they are not rivals to the central government the way that the Western senators would become to the central government there. This is a big factor in how, by the end of this period, the Eastern government is still going to be going strong, and the Western government will be a couple decades away from disappearing entirely. As a side note, it is important to remember that there is a Senate in Constantinople, an institution called the Senate. Ever since the emperor showed up, this Senate lost its primary government function. It is much more important as a gathering of senators. And this is important throughout Byzantine history, just a concept to keep in mind. The Senate is unimportant. It's a rubber stamp institution. Senators, as individuals, as those who are honored as the elites of society, they are important and will remain so throughout this period, and into the later ones as well. So just keep that in mind. Being a senator is much more important than participating in the Senate. I know that doesn't sound intuitive to us, but that's how the system is structured. It's much more a club for the people who are already important, rather than joining the Senate to become important. In this civil bureaucracy that the Roman emperors have built up, there are a few positions that I think are worth bringing up because in the depths of this period, many of them are influential in their own right, sometimes to the point of surpassing the emperors, and I think it's worth mentioning them. Now, the most important position outside of the army is the Praetorian Prefect of the East. When I say that, I will say that the whole Roman Empire was divided up into just 4 prefectures, and there are only 4 Praetorian prefects in the whole thing, with the eastern half having 2. The prefecture of Illyricum, the smaller one, is only in charge of what is now the Balkans and Greece. The Praetorian Prefect of the East is just below the emperor, in charge of everything else: Thrace near Constantinople, Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, the Libyan desert, all of it. And this naturally means that they're going to be hugely important in the government. Frankly, they're almost the prime minister of the civil service. And there are a couple of occasions where the emperors are weak non-entities, where the Praetorian Prefect of the East did run the state. So they are absolutely worth remembering during this period. But there are a couple others worth pointing out. Now, besides the most important civil bureaucrat, the Praetorian Prefect of the East, there are a couple other positions I want to note, simply as a contrast to what happens later, because the other important ministers let you know what are prioritized in a given time period of the Byzantine Empire. So I just want to point out who else are important here. Besides the Prefect of the East, you also have the Prefect of Illyricum, the other major prefecture. That's obviously going to be important. You also have the Master of Offices, who is the chief civil bureaucrat in charge of this new expanded bureaucracy. You also have the Count of Sacred Largesses. Yes, a very fancy title for the paymaster, the guy whose job it is to make sure the army and the bureaucracy all get their money. So as you can imagine, that's a very important role. You also have the Count of the Private Estates, whose job it is to manage the imperial estates. Now, this is a very important institution for both this period and what happens later. Now, it's important to keep in mind for this period that on top of the taxation system for the general government and public use, the emperors, as private citizens, by virtue of holding that post, had access to these private estates scattered throughout the empire. And these were not small amounts of lands. We're talking about somewhere between 1/10 to 1/5 of all of the private land in the Eastern Empire was privately owned by the emperor personally. This meant that the emperor could collect rents from those land and the profits of the lands directly rather than taxing them. This meant that you needed a position whose job it was just to manage the emperor's private funds. That's another thing to keep in mind. The Byzantine emperors had a private treasury and a public treasury, often because the emperors, holding private estates or even coming from wealth originally, tended to have their own wealth. And these two sources of wealth were separate, with separate ministers in charge of them. And this is important to keep in mind. The emperor doesn't just privately own the whole empire with the capacity to do with all of it as he sees fit. There is a public sphere here that the emperor has to navigate. He doesn't just privately own all of this new government to rearrange how he likes. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. It'll really help my channel, and I'll talk to you next time.